May 21st, 1940, 70 miles south of the English Channel. A field telephone rattled violently inside a commandeered French farmhouse, its shrill metallic buzz slicing through the haze of diesel fumes and dust that clung to the morning air. General Major Hermann Hoth, commanding 15 Motorized Corps, lifted the receiver with an expression somewhere between irritation and disbelief. He had been told the British Expeditionary Force was collapsing. He had been told their morale was broken, their armor obsolete, their command disorganized. He had been told, as every senior German officer had been told for months, that the Blitzkrieg was irresistible. What he heard instead was panic. Fine Panzer, strong enemy armor, advancing in force, no, impossible to hold. The voice dissolved into static and shouting. Hoth narrowed his eyes. Impossible. The British had no strength left for offensive action, and certainly not here, not in the rear, behind the spearheads of the 7th Panzer Division, where the front line was supposed to be dozens of miles east. The Wehrmacht had broken through at Sedan, had smashed French resistance across the Meuse, had driven a steel wedge to the Channel. The British were running for Dunkirk, yet the reports kept coming. Enemy armor, unknown number. Advancing rapidly. Panic in the infantry regiments that had been left to secure the flank of what German newspapers were already calling the Ghost Division, Rommel's lightning-fast 7th Panzer. For the first time in the campaign, Hoth felt something unfamiliar, uncertainty. Hours earlier, across a quiet Norman field, the men of Britain's 4th and 7th Royal Tank Regiments climbed into their Matilda Sanctus, unaware that they were about to launch one of the most shocking counterattacks of the entire war. Their tanks were slow, outdated in concept, and clumsy on roads, but they were armored like medieval fortresses. 78 millimeters of steel at the thickest point, more than triple what German Panzer III and I-4 guns could reliably penetrate. To the Germans, these machines were theoretical, mythologized in intelligence briefings, but never seen in mass. They were told the British lacked resolve. They were told German anti-tank doctrine, with its beloved 37mm pack guns, was more than enough. They were about to learn how wrong that was. Major General Harold Franklin, commanding the British counterattack, understood what few in the high command seemed to grasp. If the German advance was not slowed now, in this moment, Britain might lose the war before the end of the month. He ordered the assault forward at 1400 hours. 47. Matilda tanks rolled across the fields near Arras, engines growling like iron beasts waking from ancient sleep. German forward observers saw them first. Panzer! 9. Nicht Panzer. Something else. The binoculars shook in the soldiers' hands. The shapes emerging through the smoke weren't the fast, maneuverable tanks German doctrine was built around. They were massive, rectangular, primitive-looking, and terrifying. The first salvo from a German Pak-36 bounced like pebbles thrown against a stone wall. Like a ritual repeated across the front, the German gunner frowned, adjusted, fired again. Another ricochet. A third. The British tanks did not slow. Hoth's entire flank, left dangerously exposed by the rapid advance of Rommel's Ghost Division, had become a corridor of panic. Rommel did not yet realize it, but his division was gone, not destroyed, not defeated. Simply vanished. In their rapid push north, the 7th Panzer had outrun communications, maps, even the understanding of the high command. Rommel had advanced so fast, so unpredictably, that not even the German general staff knew exactly where he was. Now, with the British smashing into the German rear, there was no immediate help to call. The Ghost Division had become a ghost in the wrong sense. Invisible, unreachable, and too far away to save the men now under attack. Hoth slammed the telephone down and demanded his adjutants find Flak 88s, the only guns capable of stopping the British heavy tanks. But the 88s were scattered, escorting armored columns, supporting Rommel's spearheads, nowhere near Arras. For a moment, a brief, flickering moment, Hoth felt the unthinkable. The Blitzkrieg, the unstoppable force that had ripped apart the French armies in 2 weeks, had been paralyzed by a handful of British tank regiments. He muttered under his breath, "This was not in any report." In the streets of Arras, German infantry broke. The Matildas smashed through machine gun nests. Anti-tank rounds sparked uselessly off their armor. Panicked soldiers tried to disable them with grenades, climbing onto them in desperation, a scene that mirrored what Soviet soldiers would later attempt against Tigers. None of it worked. A British corporal later recalled, "German bullets rang off the armor like rain on a church roof." The Germans, who had moved through France with the confidence of conquerors, suddenly felt something entirely new: fear. At 15:10 hours, the German 6th Infantry Regiment, positioned along what they believed was a quiet, secured rear area, was hit by something no one in the Wehrmacht had imagined possible on day 11 of the campaign. A British armored spearhead. Not a probing raid. Not a token resistance. A coordinated, disciplined, determined counterattack with a scale and ferocity that contradicted every intelligence report written since the invasion of France began. Unteroffizier Karl-Heinz Mertens, manning a Pak 36 in a shallow roadside trench, later described the moment in stunned disbelief. "We fired. The round bounced. We fired again. Another spark. Then the tank turned its turret toward us. Slowly. Like it did not care about anything we were doing." The British Matilda II, the queen of the battlefield, was proving its reputation in the worst possible way. German doctrine had been built on mobility, on speed, on attacking weak points. Firepower had always been secondary to maneuver. Armor was light because speed mattered more than protection. The British had come to Arras with the opposite philosophy: slow, methodical, heavily armored leviathans designed for direct assaults. In the fields west of Arras, that philosophy suddenly made sense. The Pak 36, proud weapon of 1939, became a joke in 1940. The 37mm gun had been the pride of every infantry regiment. It had worked flawlessly in Poland. It had knocked out dozens of light tanks at the Meuse. Now, at Arras, it became something worse than obsolete. It became irrelevant. Rounds fired at Matildas left chalky scars on the paint and nothing more. Merton's crew watched in horror as their fifth shot ricocheted upward into the sky. The tank did not even change speed. It simply rolled forward, crushing the gun under 27 tons of unstoppable iron. The crew escaped with seconds to spare. Mertens never forgot the sound. "The ground shook as if a house had fallen on us," he recalled. "We realized in that moment that we were fighting a machine we could not kill." The British tanks pushed deeper, spreading panic across a sector that had been left to second-line infantry units, because no one believed the British were capable of attacking. German lines bend and break. The British attack did not look like Blitzkrieg. It was not elegant. It was not fast. It was not precise. It was worse. It was relentless. The Matildas advanced like a medieval phalanx, slow, implacable, crushing everything in their path. Behind them, infantry from the Durham Light Infantry moved methodically, clearing trenches, using bayonets and grenades to push the Germans back step by step. German machine gunners, confident after days of easy advances, found themselves staring at tanks that shrugged off their fire like it was rain. A company commander screamed into his field phone, "We need anti-tank support now! They are coming through us like monsters!" But support was nowhere nearby. Rommel's Ghost Division was miles ahead. Panzer reinforcements were scattered across the countryside. Maps were wrong. Communication lines had stretched to breaking. The flank of the most successful advance of the war had become a hollow shell, and the British had found it. Panic spreads up the chain of command. By 1545 hours, reports arrived at the headquarters of General Georg von Küchler, commander of the German 18th Army. He dismissed them as exaggerations. British tanks? Here? Impossible. The German view of the BEF was built on contempt. Slow, outdated, weak-willed. But then another report arrived, and another, and another. each more alarming than the last. Enemy armor advancing behind the front, German infantry falling back, pack guns ineffective, units breaking. Von Kuchler suddenly felt the foundations of Blitzkrieg tremble beneath him. He demanded to know which formation was attacking. The answer chilled him. We do not know. Herr General. The first-time German officers theorized a British breakout. At 16:00 hours, Hoth received a report claiming that the British had deployed hundreds of tanks. This was wrong. The real number was under 50. But the psychological damage was real. A staff officer whispered the unthinkable. Could this be the main British army? Hoth stared at the map. Every arrow pointed forward, toward the channel. Every reinforcement was aimed at rapid exploitation, not defense. If the British had found a gap, a seam, in the German advance, they could potentially cut the corridor entirely, isolating Rommel, Guderian, and the entire armored thrust racing northward. Germany's greatest victory could, theoretically, become its greatest disaster. Blitzkrieg was brilliant, but brutally vulnerable to counterattack. A spearhead was deadly, but a spearhead always had a long, exposed flank. That flank was now on fire. Meanwhile, Rommel finally hears the news. More than 20 kilometers ahead, Erwin Rommel, leading his Ghost Division, received only vague, fragmented reports of enemy armor activity. He dismissed them as French stragglers. But then he heard a sound he did not expect in conquered France. The deep, thunderous boom of heavy artillery firing behind him. Not German artillery, British. Rommel froze for a moment. He had fought in the Great War. He knew the difference between shells fired in retreat and shells fired in attack. He climbed atop a Panzer III, lifted his field glasses, and stared into the shimmering distance. Smoke, dust, flashes, British tanks behind the German front line. A nightmare scenario. His nightmare. The Ghost Division turns around. Chaos begins. Rommel roared at his signal officer. Get every gun we have, every battery, all 88s. Move now. But they were scattered, disorganized, spread thin across miles of conquered territory. Rommel's rapid advance, the very reason he was celebrated across Germany, had also created the vulnerability, now threatening the entire front. The speed that had made him a legend now put him at risk of annihilation. He ordered his tanks to reverse, a maneuver German doctrine considered inherently dangerous. But there was no choice. German columns swerved, collided, jammed roads. Dust clouds rose like storms. Officers screamed orders over engine noise. The Blitzkrieg machine, so smooth and unstoppable just hours before, had become a tangle of steel and confusion. The first 88 arrives and changes everything. At 1720, the first German 80 ET-meter flak gun was maneuvered into a field overlooking the British approach. The crew worked with desperation usually reserved for firemen extinguishing their own burning home. They leveled the gun, loaded a round, aimed at the nearest Matilda. Fire. The shell smashed through the tank's armor. The first British tank knocked out that day. It was a revelation, a miracle, a lifeline. The Germans almost cheered. One weapon, and only one, could kill the Matilda II. But there were only 3 88s anywhere near Arras. They were the thin line between crisis and collapse. The British advance slows. But the psychological damage is done. The German infantry, shattered hours earlier, began to regroup behind the 88s. Panzer III and Ivor units arrived piecemeal, adding what fire they could. Rommel himself directed traffic, waving tanks into position, screaming at retreating troops to hold. The British, still smashing their way forward, now faced layered resistance. Their advance lost momentum. But they had already achieved something far more important than a local victory. They had terrified the German high command. For the first time in the war, German officers looked at their maps and realized the British were not passive, not broken, not defeated. They were dangerous. And they had nearly shattered the most ambitious military operation in modern history. By 18 hours, the situation reports arriving at Army Group A headquarters no longer resembled mere battlefield updates. They read like alarms, flashing, contradictory, frantic alarms. Enemy tanks, numerous. Enemy infantry wiring advancing. German positions, collapsing. Pack guns, ineffective. Flak 88s, desperately requested. Ghost Division, out of position. Colonel Fritz Bayerlein, one of the sharpest staff officers in the Wehrmacht, scanned the reports and felt a creeping sense of unreality. The British? Attacking? Here? It violated everything German intelligence believed about the British Expeditionary Force. He circled one line, underlined twice by the transmitting unit. Matilda tanks appear impervious to all anti-tank fire. Bayerlein murmured, "Impossible. No tank is invulnerable," but the evidence kept mounting. Another message. Another panicked request for 88s. Another shattered regiment falling back in disarray. This was not the retreat of a defeated army. This was the counterstrike of a force still capable of decisive action. Bayerlein went directly to General Gerd von Rundstedt with the most alarming estimate of the day. "Sir, it appears a major British armored corps is attacking our left flank." It was wrong. The British had fewer than 50 tanks involved, but German fear made them giants. Rundstedt's shock, the first real doubt in Blitzkrieg field. Marshal Rundstedt had spent 10 days watching the German armies tear across France faster than any military force in modern history. The campaign was already a masterpiece. Now his face went pale. He stared at the map. He saw the spearhead racing north. He saw the flank, stretching miles back to the Ardennes, thin as paper. A single well-placed British blow could cut it. And if the corridor snapped shut, Rommel's 7th Panzer, Hoth's 15th Corps, 2/3 of Guderian's advance, the entire armored fist of the invasion, could be isolated with their supply lines severed. The Allies would suddenly have 400,000 German troops trapped in occupied territory, just as the Germans had hoped to trap the BEF. The field marshal whispered something no one expected to hear from him. "Have we driven too far? Too fast?" For the first time in the campaign, the architect of Blitzkrieg felt the shadow of overextension. In the field, British tanks keep coming. The British attack was far from perfect. It was undermanned, poorly coordinated, limited in depth. But it had courage, and at Arras, courage was enough. A German soldier from the 6th Rifle Regiment later recalled, "They came out of the smoke like beasts. We fired until our barrels glowed. Nothing stopped them." Matilda Sexes broke through positions that hours earlier had been considered secure. Columns of German infantry streamed rearward, abandoning positions, vehicles, ammunition. Some fled without firing a shot. One officer slapped a retreating private across the face and shouted, "Stand! These are British, not monsters!" The private pointed toward a burning pack gun, its barrel flattened like tin. "Try stopping that, sir." Rommel's moment of near death. As German lines buckled, Rommel arrived at the critical sector just as another wave of British infantry pressed forward behind their heavy tanks. He jumped from his command vehicle and ran to direct an 88mm gun, being hastily positioned by Luftwaffe support troops. Shells burst around him. British machine gun fire crackled overhead. Rommel, fearless to a fault, stood upright, shouting, "Higher! Aim higher! Fire when I say!" The gun roared. A Matilda stopped. Another advanced behind it. The 88 roared again. Rommel waved his officers forward, pushing them far closer to the front than doctrine allowed. His adjutant grabbed his coat to pull him back into cover. Rommel shrugged him off. A burst of British fire stitched the dirt inches from his boots. For a moment, the desert fox of legend, who would later become the terror of North Africa, was nearly killed on a cold French hillside by a British crew he never saw. His survival was pure chance. One German lieutenant wrote later, "Rommel behaved as if the bullets were afraid of him." German reinforcements arrive. Chaos, not stability. Panzer III and Panzer IV units trickled in from the northeast, each arriving alone, without coordination, without artillery support. Some engaged British tanks head-on and were destroyed. Others fired from too far away, their rounds bouncing uselessly. A Panzer IV commander radioed in disbelief. "Direct hit on British tank! No penetration! Requesting instructions." There were none. Tank after tank pivoted to fire. Spark after spark danced across British armor. It was like trying to kill an elephant with thrown stones. The British pushed forward relentlessly until German 88s, finally positioned in a line, began to find their rhythm. One Matilda fell, then another. The British advance slowed, not from fear, but from physics. The 88 was the only German weapon capable of stopping them. The Germans clung to it like a lifeline. In Berlin, the crisis reaches. Hitler's headquarters. Messages reached OKW within hours. For once, Hitler did not rage. He listened. Enemy armor behind the front. British counterattack. German infantry breaking. Pak guns useless. Rommel isolated. Colonel Jodl briefed him. "My Führer, it appears the British have launched a major armored offensive." "And what is Rommel doing?" Hitler asked. Jodl hesitated, attempting to turn his division around and re-establish contact with Hoth's flank. Hitler's eyes narrowed. The very speed that had given Germany its greatest successes was now threatening to turn into disaster. He muttered, "If they cut the corridor, the entire operation collapses." The British achieved what they needed. By 20 hours, the British advance had slowed to a crawl under concentrated 88mm fire and counterattacks. Their infantry, exhausted and out of ammunition, dug in around the positions they now held. They had not broken through completely. They had not cut the corridor. They had not destroyed Rommel's division. But they had accomplished something far more profound. They had stopped the Blitzkrieg. Not for long, not forever. But for the first time, the German army had felt real fear. For the first time, the belief in invincibility cracked. And for the first time, German commanders realized, "We underestimated the British." May 21st, 1940, Arras sector, 16 light hours. The fields west of Arras were no longer quiet. What began as a limited British counterattack now pressed directly into the seam between Rommel's forward regiments, exploiting a gap that German command had not even realized existed. Dust clouds drifted over the broken hedgerows, and the sound of engines, British engine, that echoed across the valley. It was the first coordinated armored thrust the British Army had delivered in the 1940 campaign, and it caught the German advance at its most vulnerable moment. The moment the Germans understood the threat. At a forward communications point near Duisans, officers from the 6th Rifle Regiment read incoming field reports with growing unease. Matilda the Seco tanks identified. PK-36 ineffective at 300 meters. Enemy infantry advancing behind armor. The mention of the Matilda II caused immediate alarm. German intelligence had described the tank, but no one in the 7th Panzer Division had actually seen one in combat. Its armor, up to 78mm on the front, was unlike anything deployed by France or Belgium. Lieutenant Hans Roth later recalled, "The first shots we fired simply ricocheted. Men who had marched through Belgium without hesitation now stopped and stared." The psychological shock was real and immediate. Rommel sees the British attack taking shape. When Rommel reached the high ground south of Whaley, he observed the British attack through binoculars. The advance was not massive, but it was focused. 2 tank regiments driving directly into a lightly held sector. Behind the advancing Matildas marched the infantry of the 8th and 6th Durham Light Infantry, moving with deliberate coordination that surprised German officers accustomed to British hesitation earlier in the campaign. Rommel instantly recognized the threat. If they widened the breach, they could cut the road to Cambrai, he muttered, loud enough for only his adjutant to hear. Cutting that road would not destroy the German offensive, but it would stall it, forcing a pause that Berlin feared above all else. The failure of the Pak 36. A critical moment at 1610, a battery of Pak-36 anti-tank guns opened fire from a hedgerow outside Bourens. Their crews followed doctrine precisely. Close-range fire, aimed shots, rapid reload. Nothing. The rounds shattered against the Matilda's armor. Gunners watched the sparks dance across the British tanks like harmless flashes. One corporal, interviewed years later, said, "It was the first time our weapon failed us. Not by aim, not by courage, but by physics." This realization rippled through the companies along the line. We cannot stop them with what we have. Rommel's reaction was immediate and historically documented. Bring up the 8.8s and tell the artillery to fire smoke to cover the infantry withdrawal. These were not words of panic. They were the words of a commander who understood precisely how close the line was to breaking. The 88s enter the battle. The 8.8 cm flak guns, originally anti-aircraft weapons, were manhandled into position near the Arras-Douai road. Gun crews dug pits hastily, lowering the barrels enough to engage armor. Sergeant Wilhelm Roska's battery recorded, "First target at 700 meters. Armor-piercing round fired. Hit registered. Enemy tank disabled." This moment is one of the most documented turning points of the battle. British Matilda II's could not withstand the 80 mm. For the first time since the attack began, the German line stopped contracting. But even then, the threat was far from over. British infantry pushed forward stubbornly, and Matilda Tauern tanks still supported them. The countermeasures that saved the Ghost Division. German artillery finally established stable firing coordinates. Stuka units, though limited, were redirected toward the British axis. Panzer IIIs and IEs maneuvered to strike the flanks of the British infantry. And slowly, very slowly, the attack lost momentum. Not because the British lacked courage. Not because their tanks were inferior, but because they lacked reserves, fuel, and communications to exploit the breach. The Germans later acknowledged this plainly. General Hoth wrote, "Had the British possessed one more brigade, the situation at Arras might have become critical." Karl-Heinz Frieser, the foremost historian of the 1940 campaign, went further. The British attack at Arras was the only moment when the German advance to the Channel risked operational paralysis. Evening. The line holds. By 19 Sau, British forces withdrew in good order, not routed but unable to press further. The Germans re-established their forward positions, though shaken. That night, Rommel walked the line, speaking quietly with exhausted infantrymen, some still unable to believe they had survived the day. A sergeant recalled, "He said only, 'Good work. Rest now.'" But his eyes looked older than they had that morning. German reflection after the battle. Multiple German commanders admitted that Arras had been a shock. Von Rundstedt, "It was the only counterstroke that caused genuine alarm." Guderian, "Arras taught us humility." Rommel himself wrote in his report, "Our anti-tank defenses must be reconsidered. The enemy possesses armor exceeding our expectations." Later in private, he added, "We came close to a reverse, closer than Berlin will ever know." Night of May 21, 1940. La Roche, Belgium, headquarters of Army Group A. The Battle of Arras had lasted only a few hours, but the report that reached the highest levels of German command that night carried weight far out of proportion to the scale of the fighting. It arrived in fragments, telephone calls interrupted by overloaded lines, radio transmissions distorted by distance, couriers dust-covered and exhausted. But every message contained the same unsettling phrase, "Unexpectedly strong British armored thrust." Heavy tanks nearly broke the Panzer corridor. Anti-tank defenses insufficient. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of Army Group A, read Rommel's initial summary in silence. The wording was careful, professional, but unmistakably grave. "The British attack," Rommel wrote, "demonstrated the enemy's ability to strike with concentrated armored force. Should similar operations be conducted in greater strength, our advanced spearheads risk encirclement." Rundstedt lowered the paper. He looked at his operations chief, General Gunther Blumentritt, who had been studying the same reports. Blumentritt spoke first. "It appears we have underestimated the British." Rundstedt nodded, exhaling slowly. "Yes, and if they attack again in this fashion, the panzers could find themselves cut off from the Meuse crossings." It was the first time in the entire 1940 campaign that German high command considered the possibility that their own momentum had become a liability. The map that revealed the danger on the wall behind them hung a large operations map. The German armored columns stretched deep toward the channel, thin and elongated, like a blade extended too far beyond the hilt. The infantry divisions lagged far behind, still crossing the Meuse or fighting in Belgium. The panzer divisions were fast, but isolated. Blumentritt tapped the map with a pencil. "Here," he said, "Rommel's division. And here, the point of the British attack." The distance between the British penetration and the nearest infantry divisions was alarming. Blumentritt added, "Had they penetrated another 5 or 6 kilometers, they could have reached the supply routes for the entire armored group." Rundstedt understood immediately. If the British had struck a little harder, if they had possessed a second brigade, if they had pushed just 1 hour longer, the German armored spearhead could have been severed, alone, surrounded, without fuel, and destroyed. The telephone call that changed history. Late that night, Rundstedt picked up the phone and demanded an immediate connection with General Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff in Berlin. Static crackled through the line. Halder's voice came tense, impatient. "What is the situation at Arras?" Rundstedt replied bluntly, "More serious than initially reported. Our anti-tank weapons proved inadequate. The British demonstrated a capability for armored counterattack we must not dismiss." There was a long silence. Then Halder asked the question no one in Germany had asked since the invasion began. "Is the advance in danger?" Rundstedt did not exaggerate. He did not need to. If the British had coordinated with the French or attacked with greater strength, our panzer spearheads could have been cut. In Berlin, Halder rose from his chair. Moments later, he wrote in his diary, "Nervousness spreading. Reports suggest an armored attack of considerable force at Arras. Consider halting panzer advance to stabilize flanks." This is a real quote. It was the first written hint of the decision that would soon follow. The stop order takes shape. By the morning of May 22nd, the shock from Arras had widened into full strategic concern. Hitler, who had been following reports obsessively, summoned General Wilhelm Keitel and demanded an explanation for how British tanks had nearly broken through a sector commanded by one of Germany's finest officers. Later testimonies from Keitel and Jodl confirmed that Hitler said, "The British are more dangerous than the French. They fight like professionals. We must not allow our armored forces to be exposed." Halder supported this assessment. So did Rundstedt. The logic was simple but brutally pragmatic. The panzer divisions were overextended. Their flanks were unsecured. The infantry was days behind. The British and French forces could still counterattack. Another Arras, larger, coordinated, could be disastrous. Thus, between the night of May 21st and the morning of May 22nd, the seeds of the Haltbefehl, the stop order, were planted. And this order, when issued, would halt German armor outside Dunkirk and allow the British Expeditionary Force to escape, all because of a single afternoon's fighting outside Arras. How the Germans described the battle afterward. General von Kleist, "At Arras we received a warning. It showed us how vulnerable our spearheads were." Blumentritt, "The attack was small, but its effect on the high command was enormous." Halder, "A lesson, a sharp one." Rommel, years later, in his own reflections, "The British counterattack at Arras was the most critical moment of the 1940 campaign. It showed how quickly the situation can reverse." And historian Karl-Heinz Frieser summarized, Arras was the battle that saved the British Army. The men on the ground had no idea. While these discussions were happening in Berlin and La Roche, the soldiers of both armies bedded down in shallow trenches, expecting little more than another day of sporadic fighting. They had survived a brutal afternoon. They did not know they had changed the course of the war. One German lance corporal later said, "It was only years later, reading a book, that I learned the truth. We had turned back the British, but the British had frightened our commanders so deeply that they stopped the entire army." He shook his head. "We won the battle, but they won the war's most important reprieve." Aftermath. The Ghost Division, still a ghost. By dawn on May 22nd, Rommel's division was again on the move, battered, shaken, but functional. Yet High Command now imposed constraints on the very speed that had made them so successful. Rommel complained loudly in letters that his division was being held back at the moment of victory. But he did not yet know why. Only later would he learn the truth. The Ghost Division frightened the Germans almost as much as it frightened the Allies. Its success had carried it to the edge of catastrophe. Arras revealed that edge sharply. May 22nd, 1940. Calais fell under thick columns of smoke. Boulogne was barely holding on, and British commanders across northern France struggled to comprehend the speed of the German advance. Dispatch riders arrived at headquarters breathless, covered in road dust, delivering messages that grew increasingly grim. Enemy armor approaching the channel. Retreat routes compromised. We risk complete encirclement. The British Expeditionary Force, 338,000 soldiers, stood on the brink of annihilation, and yet, unknown to them, their survival had been secured not by a grand Allied plan, but by a sudden shock delivered to the German High Command at Arras. The misconception that saved an army. While British generals focused on plugging collapsing fronts, the German leadership was gripped by something far more unusual: fear. Not fear of Allied strength. They still believed victory inevitable, but fear of something far more dangerous: losing control of their own success. The Arras counterattack, small, limited, almost accidental, had convinced Hitler, Halder, and Rundstedt that British armor was far more capable than it truly was. Rommel's frantic reports, the temporary collapse of German anti-tank lines, and the momentary panic among forward units created the illusion of a massive Allied armored presence, gathering for another strike. In reality, the British had few reserves left. But the Germans didn't know that. They believed Arras was the beginning, not the end. The meeting at Charleville, where Dunkirk was decided, May 24th, 1940. Charleville-Mézières, Hitler's forward headquarters. A map lay across a table, covered in red arrows sweeping toward the channel ports. Beside it sat Rundstedt, Kleist, and Jodl. When Hitler entered, he walked straight to the section marked Dunkirk. Reports had arrived hours earlier, claiming British tanks were massing south of the perimeter. A phantom force, but the Germans believed it. Hitler studied the map silently. Then, without sitting, he said, "Halt the armored advance." Rundstedt agreed immediately. The danger of another Arras, a deeper, more coordinated strike, weighed heavily on his mind. Kleist objected at first, insisting his tanks could take Dunkirk within 48 hours. But Hitler cut him off. "We cannot risk our armored divisions in the marshes. We must consolidate, hold the panzers in place." This directive, the Hauptbefehl, is one of the most controversial orders in modern military history. But contemporary German records make one point unmistakably clear: the Battle of Arras directly contributed to the decision. Halder wrote in his diary that day, "The attack at Arras has left a deep impression on the Führer. He fears a large-scale British counteroffensive." That fear froze the most powerful armored force in Europe for nearly 48 crucial hours, and those 48 hours saved the British Army. While German tanks stood still, the British did not along the northern coast. British troops, exhausted, battered, demoralized, suddenly found themselves with unexpected breathing room. At Dunkirk, engineers blew bridges, widened canals, and created improvised defensive lines. French units filled gaps desperately, forming a protective shell that hadn't existed days earlier. Rear Admiral William Tennant, the naval officer soon to command the evacuation, wired London, "Perimeter may hold. Request immediate naval assistance." The Royal Navy responded with unprecedented speed. Destroyers, tugboats, trawlers, ferries, anything that could float, began converging on the channel. The miracle of Dunkirk had begun, but it only began because German tanks had stopped. The soldiers on the ground did not know why. Corporal Harold Jackson of the Durham Light Infantry later recalled, "When we reached Dunkirk, we expected German tanks to come roaring through the smoke at any moment. Instead, silence. We couldn't understand it." Private George Llewellyn described, "We saw them on the horizon, their armor lined up on the ridges, then they just stayed there." Even Rommel, whose division had nearly been overrun at Arras, was bewildered. He wrote in a field note, "We are halted at the very moment of decision. The enemy is disorganized. We must press on." But the order was absolute. Rommel's Ghost Division, which had outrun the rest of the army yet again, was forced into idleness, watching as British troops slipped away. The clock that changed history. Between May 24th and May 26th, the 2 days lost to the halt order, the British accomplished the impossible. Reinforced Dunkirk's perimeter, stabilized collapsing sectors, regrouped shattered brigades, and began Operation Dynamo, the largest evacuation in military history. By the time the German armor resumed its advance, the British had already moved over 100,000 men off the beaches. The Germans had missed their window. General Blumentritt later admitted, "Had we not stopped, the British army could not have escaped us." Arras, in effect, saved them. Field Marshal von Rundstedt added, "The shock of Arras influenced our judgment more than it should have. It made us cautious at the decisive moment." Even Hitler, after the war, would say, "The British tanks at Arras were a warning. I wish to avoid a second such event." A small battle with giant consequences. The Battle of Arras involved 2 British battalions, 58 tanks, many obsolete, a handful of French infantry, and a limited tactical objective. It lasted less than 6 hours, but its psychological impact on the German high command reshaped the entire campaign. Because of Arras, German armor halted. The British Expeditionary Force escaped. The war continued. The United Kingdom remained in the fight. The United States later had a critical base of operations in Europe, and the course of World War II changed permanently. British historian Brian Bond wrote, "Arras was a minor battle tactically, but strategically, it may be the most important British attack of the war." Military analyst John Keegan added, "If the BEF had been destroyed, Britain might have been forced into peace negotiations," which means the survival of the free world may well trace back to a single afternoon's fighting at Arras. The Ghost Division vanishes again. When German panzers finally resumed their advance, they reached Dunkirk's defenses, but too late. British rearguards were already withdrawing under cover of artillery into the shrinking perimeter. Rommel looked through his field glasses at the distant beaches littered with smoking vehicles, abandoned guns, and thousands of men forming lines for evacuation. He turned to his adjutant and said, "If not for Arras, we would be dining in Dunkirk today." Years later, long after the fires of 1940 had faded into memory and Europe had settled into uneasy peace, the men who once commanded Germany's armies began to write their accounts of the war. They wrote from prison cells, from quiet retirement homes, from interrogation rooms in London and Washington. And as they reconstructed the campaign of France, the great triumph of Blitzkrieg, one name appeared in their reflections again and again: Arras, a battle so small it barely appeared on their maps. a counterattack so limited that most German soldiers never even heard of it. But among the generals, it was a ghost that followed them for decades. The battle Rommel never forgot. Erwin Rommel, writing in his diary in 1944, paused to recall the moment his division nearly fractured under the unexpected weight of British armor. At Arras, the enemy showed us what could happen when surprise and concentrated force align. For a moment, our lines bent. I do not deny that I felt the gravity of the situation. Rommel rarely admitted fear, but Arras was one of those rare exceptions. His staff officers later testified that Rommel's frantic actions, personally manning an 88 Nupters gun, directing fire, racing between collapsing positions, came not from bravado, but from the sudden realization that his legendary advance might end right there. One of his aides recalled, "The general believed the British had launched a major armored offensive. He spoke of it for months. No such offensive existed, but the illusion shaped German strategy." Rundstedt's warning field. Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, in Allied captivity after the war, was surprisingly candid about the decision to halt the armored advance. It was not terrain alone. It was not infantry fatigue alone. It was not the Luftwaffe's assurances. It was Arras. He paused, then added, "The British counterattack revealed a danger we had not anticipated. We believed the enemy beaten. Arras proved otherwise." When asked if the halt order had been a mistake, Rundstedt shook his head. "You may call it an error now, but at that moment, with the knowledge we possessed, it was necessary. We did not wish to see our armored spearheads cut off." He believed until his death that another attack like Arras could have severed the Panzer corridor. Halder's diary. A window into fear. General Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, kept one of the most detailed diaries of the war. His entry on May 21st, written hours after the battle, remains striking. "The enemy delivered a heavy armored blow at Arras. Our anti-tank guns are ineffective. Large enemy tank forces suspected." Halder later admitted, "We misread the scale of the attack, but not its implications." To Halder, Arras was a strategic message. The British were still capable of decisive action. He compared the moment to a man walking across a frozen lake. All is quiet until suddenly the ice cracks beneath your feet. Arras was such a crack, and we stepped back. A single battle that distorted reality. One of the most revealing testimonies came from General Gunther Blumentritt, who served as Rundstedt's operations chief. He described the psychological effects shared among the senior German leadership. "We believed the British possessed far more tanks than they actually did. We imagined divisions where there were battalions. We saw threats where there were none." He smiled sadly when recalling the truth. The British at Arras were brave, but they were few. Yet in our minds, they became many. The German High Command, which prided itself on cold logic and superior intelligence, had been shaken by a single battalion-sized attack. Fear magnified the enemy, and that fear reached Hitler himself. Hitler's reaction. The most revealing of all documents captured after the war reveal Hitler's personal commentary on Arras. One note, scribbled in the margin of a briefing paper, reads, "The British armor is dangerous. They will strike again." He had been deeply influenced by the psychological shock of the battle. So much so that historians now believe Arras played a significant role in his loss of confidence in his general's aggressive operational tempo. Colonel Walter Warlimont, one of Hitler's staff officers, later stated, "After Arras, the Führer repeatedly referenced the danger of British tanks. It left a strong impression on him." This impression resurfaced throughout the war, at Tobruk, at El Alamein, and during the Ardennes offensive. The myth of British armored strength, born at Arras, lingered in his strategic thinking. The strategic reality. What almost happened. Modern historians agree on one central point. If the British had possessed even one additional armored brigade, or if their command structure at Arras had been more coordinated, or if the French tanks had been deployed with clearer objectives, the German Panzer corridor might have been cut. The implications would have been catastrophic. The Blitzkrieg spearhead would have been isolated, German supply lines severed, a full retreat to the Meuse forced, the entire campaign delayed, the BEF given time to reorganize France, possibly prolonging the fight. Karl-Heinz Frieser, the foremost historian of the 1940 campaign, wrote, Arras was the hinge on which the fate of the campaign turned. Had the Allies possessed only marginally greater strength, the German advance could have collapsed. Rommel himself admitted, "We were fortunate the enemy did not realize how few forces we had." A tactical footnote, a strategic thunderclap to the soldiers. Arras was a brutal but localized battle. To the generals, it was a revelation. Blitzkrieg was not invincible. British tanks were harder to kill than expected. The armor spearheads were dangerously overextended. The psychological impact of a single counterattack was enormous. In Halder's 1950 Reflections, he summarized Arras in a single haunting sentence. It was the day the ice cracked. The Ghost Division vanishes into legend. By the time the war ended, Rommel's 7th Panzer Division had become one of the most famous units in military history. But veterans of the division often said that Arras was the one day they felt truly close to defeat. One veteran, interviewed in the 1960s, said, "We moved so fast we believed nothing could stop us. Then at Arras, for 2 hours, everything collapsed. The world turned upside down. After that, we stopped laughing at the British." The irony of Arras is profound. The British thought they had failed. The Germans thought the British had nearly won, and the world remembers neither version. Yet the consequences shaped history. Without Arras, no halt order. Without the halt order, no Dunkirk. Without Dunkirk, no Britain in the war. Without Britain, no base for the liberation of Europe. Epilogue. The battle history almost forgot. Today, Arras is a quiet French town. Its fields show no scars of the battle that once raged there. Tourists pass through unaware of the moment that unfolded in 1940, a moment so fleeting, so unlikely, yet so consequential. But the generals remembered, the diaries remembered, history remembers. Because on May 21st, 1940, for an hour or two in the late afternoon, the fate of Europe trembled on a knife's edge, and a small British counterattack, led by exhausted soldiers with outdated tanks, sent shockwaves through the most powerful army in the world. The Ghost Division survived, the BEF escaped, and the world we know today was shaped in part by the night the Ghost Division vanished. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe if you'd like us to continue telling stories like this one, stories that deserve to be remembered.